Welcome to Catholic Mystery, where we open up the scriptures to the mystery of our Catholic faith. In this video, we'll wrap up the first half of Matthew 24, summarize some popular modern interpretations, and learn how the Church uses Matthew 24 in her teachings about the last days. Join us and explore the mystery of the end times. We've just finished Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, some of the most confusing verses in the Gospels. Many modern readers assume these verses are about the end of the world and Christ's second coming. How else can we understand details like the sun and the moon darkening, or the stars falling from heaven, or all the tribes of the earth mourning, or especially this image of the Son of Man coming on the clouds? But over the last couple of videos, we've walked through all this imagery in the Old Testament and drew out what the Church calls the primary literal sense of the text. And by reading these verses in the way the Church guides us, consistent within the genre of Old Testament prophecy, saw how they were fulfilled in the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We're going to finish this first section of Matthew 24 with verses 32 through 34 and ask a couple of questions about Matthew 24 in total. Number one, what is the meaning of Matthew 24 verses 32 through 34? Number two, what are some popular interpretations of Matthew 24? And number three, how does the Catholic Church use Matthew 24 in her teachings about the last days? Let's ask our first question, namely, what is the meaning of Matthew 24, verses 32 through 34? In verse 32, Jesus gives an analogy for his prophecy of the destruction of the temple. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Why does Jesus use an analogy of a fig tree? Well, for several reasons. In Matthew 21, on the Monday of Holy Week, days before his Passion, Jesus cursed a fig tree before entering the temple area, causing it to immediately wither. Jesus cursed the fig tree because it had produced no fruit. The fig tree was a symbol associated with the blessings of the Old Covenant, its fullness realized with the first temple under Solomon nearly 1,000 years prior. The cursing of the fig tree, from that perspective, was a prophetic sign of the fruitlessness of the Old Covenant in the first century. Additionally, signs, when given by prophets, would set in motion future events. The sign of the cursing and withering of the fig tree would also point to the passing away of Jerusalem's temple and the Old Covenant in 70 AD. But the primary reason for the analogy of a fig tree is because of the nature of a fig tree itself. Fig trees have long agricultural cycles and take many years before they produce fruit. So too with this prophecy of Jesus. Jesus had prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem's temple nearly a generation before it happened, as early as 30 AD, according to some scholars. And it would take until 66 AD, almost 33 years, before false messiahs would obtain control of Jerusalem and its temple. After that, the destruction of the temple by Roman armies came to fruition quickly, within 3.5 years. Jesus also reminded his disciples in verse 33, "So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates," or in the Greek, doors. Which gates or doors does Christ mean? If we stick with the narrative, we see that Christ is talking about the gates or doors to the temple, the same gates that the first century historians Josephus and Tacitus reported opening of their own accord in the middle of the night, as we covered in our Sign in the Sky video. And the Son of Man did come in judgment with the Roman armies. And they came to the doors of the temple and pulled every stone of the temple to the ground. Jesus' prophetic words in Matthew 24, verse 2 had come true. "Truly, I say to you, there will not be here left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." This brings us to our second question, namely, what are some modern interpretations of Matthew 24? We've spent significant time demonstrating how these passages were fulfilled in the historical destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. At this point, we might ask what Matthew 24 has to do with the end times at all. And one answer is that these verses in Matthew are foundational for many popular beliefs about the end times in other Christian traditions. We've covered some of these popular interpretations throughout the series, but they all begin by reading Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31 through a modern lens, and not from the perspective of what the human authors intended to convey to the audience of their time and culture, and especially not considering the genre of prophecy where truth is differently expressed than in prose. And so, many believe these verses are primarily about Christ's second coming, which has not been fulfilled yet. But then we have an immediate problem, because Matthew 24, verse 34 says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Jesus said that those things would happen within a generation of his life, but the end of the world didn't come. Jesus was a failed prophet, according to the dominant opinion of 20th century secular scholarship. Many Christians, still asserting Matthew 24 verses 29 through 31 were unfulfilled, argued for a different meaning of the phrase, "this generation." One was to argue that generation meant race, and asserted that what Jesus actually meant was, "Truly I say to you, this race," usually meaning the Jews, "will not pass away till all these things take place." The other was to argue that what Jesus meant in verse 34 when he was talking to the people of his time was, "Truly I say to you, that generation," meaning a future generation, "will not pass away till all these things take place." Both ways then interpret Matthew 24 as an unfulfilled prophecy which has yet to happen. And then the end times playbooks were created. There's dozens of variations based on complex schemes to predict how these supposedly unfulfilled passages in Matthew 24 will be fulfilled in modern times. And those schemes are also based on pulling other Bible verses out of context, most commonly from the book of Revelation, and also reading those literalistically as well. For example, we may have heard that there will be 7 definitive signs we can recognize that will signal Christ's second coming. Things like wars, rumors of wars, or famines and earthquakes. We may have heard that the second coming will hinge on events in modern Israel, because Jesus prophesied that the temple was to be destroyed, and so to supposedly fulfill these passages, another generation of Jews will have to rebuild the temple again in modern Israel so it can be destroyed again. And we may have heard about an upcoming 7-year tribulation for either Jews or Christians. And this is based on this verse about the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel as unfulfilled, and misreading Daniel 9's famous week of seasons as we covered in our abomination and desolation video. And so many Christians proclaim that a desolating sacrilege will come and usher in a 7-year tribulation of epic proportions for a future generation. We may have heard that there will be a future Great Tribulation to come, and all sorts of terrible events will befall Christians. And it's sad that Christians throw this term Great Tribulation around, because many Christians read every problem in our church or society at large as signs of a supposed imminent Great Tribulation, and many are fearful and are circling the wagons. But the term Great Tribulation, referring to a supposed future Great Tribulation, came into modern usage from Christians who believe Matthew 24, verse 21 is unfulfilled. But as we covered in our Great Tribulation video and saw in the Catechism, the Church recognizes the Great Tribulation as a past event fulfilled primarily in the 3.5-year war between the Romans and the Jews and the passing away of the Old Covenant with the temple's destruction. And while the church does teach about a final trial of the church to come, and there may be predestined conditions as God wills, it's much different than other faith traditions typically portray it. And it's sad, because Christians spend inordinate amounts of spiritual effort speculating about what that desolating sacrilege might be. But as we covered in our Abomination and Desolation video, commentators throughout the history of the church saw the desolating sacrilege of Daniel and his famous week of seasons fulfilled in the 1st century. And Luke, inspired by the Holy Spirit, associates the desolating sacrilege with armies that would surround and desolate Jerusalem in the first century. And it's sad, because by focusing on a supposed temple to be rebuilt in modern Israel, many Christians do not perceive that the true temple of God is already here, nor do they understand their role in the building of God's true temple. The church has great hope for the Jews, and in fact they play an essential role in the church's teaching about the last days. But the church doesn't hold that every Jew needs to be relocated to modern Israel so they can build a temple again in order for God to bring them into the fullness of the new covenant. A supposedly earthly temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem is not part of the biblical data. And it's sad. These supposed 7 signs lead many Christians to worry about rumors of war or earthquakes. But those were events of a prophecy already fulfilled in the first century. And even in the first century, Christ warned his disciples not to pay heed to those. And it's sad. Many non-Catholic Christians believe these playbooks to be fundamental tenets of their faith, not realizing how weak the foundations for those tenets actually are. And it's very sad, because all of this is based on interpreting the meaning of this generation as this race. Usually that interpretation is accompanied by an interpreter looking up generation in a Greek lexicon where it says that race is one possible translation. But that usage comes from other Greek writers and is not found in the Bible. Or taking the word this, giving it a 180-degree twist to make it mean that, as in that future generation. Which of course turns the verse into the opposite of what it means. That is the opposite of this. Suffice to say, no serious scholar finds linguistic support for either interpretation. But you don't need to know Greek to check that. We've listed all the examples of the phrase, this generation, in the New Testament here. Look up these passages and substitute the meaning, this race, or a future generation, into any of these examples and see if it makes sense. It takes 15 minutes, and you'll sleep better. It's fair to say many believe Matthew 24 verses 29 through 31 are unfulfilled. Many Bible commentaries from the 20th century assert that those verses are about Christ's second coming. It's also fair to say that 20th century modern scholarship read the New Testament largely in isolation apart from the Old. But Catholic and Protestant scholars in the 20th and 21st centuries went back to the Old Testament and cataloged the imagery that Jesus draws upon in these verses. And they came to the same opinion about these verses that the historical church did, that they were fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. We cover some of their work in our videos. Scholarly work can take more than a generation to disseminate in the form of commentaries. Sharing these videos can disseminate their work faster. We can also credit the work of later 20th and 21st century scholarship to help us better understand Matthew 24. Scholars that study how ancient documents are organized know that the Bible's chapter and verse numbers are not part of the original text. Ancient texts use different methods to distinguish sections. One of those methods is a literary device called an inclusio, meaning pairs of similar phrases that serve as bookends to bracket a subject. Scholars began to identify these inclusios in Matthew. And it was late in the 20th century where a particularly important inclusio was identified. And one reason it went unnoticed was that the insertion of the chapter 24 header broke up the literary unit. Most readers begin at chapter 24. But if we start with the first inclusio in chapter 23, verse 36, truly I say to you, all this will come upon this generation, and keep reading, we'll pass through the verses associated with the destruction of Jerusalem's temple in the first century. And when we hit the matching inclusio of chapter 24, verse 34, we've come to the end of a literary unit, the end of one subject. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. In verse 34, Matthew concludes this section with the events associated with that first century generation. This second inclusio serves as the end of one subject, and then there is a transition into a new literary unit beginning in verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. And we can immediately see a contrast between two distinct events. Because Jesus prophesied the events that would precede the destruction of Jerusalem in his, or this generation, up to verse 34 in a definitive time frame. But verse 36 begins with the phrase, "But of that day and hour, no one knows," referring to the day heaven and earth will pass away. And Jesus will continue in Matthew 24 through chapter 25 with the subject of his second coming at the end of time, continually emphasizing that unknown day and hour. The church considers that section of Matthew the primary biblical data on Christ's second coming. We'll cover that section, so make sure you subscribe to our channel. So what's the use of a fulfilled prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem? To answer that, let's address our third question, namely, how does the Catholic Church use Matthew 24 in her teachings about the last days? And one of the best ways to answer it is to look at how she uses the passages in her liturgy. While the Church doesn't read directly from this section in Matthew during her Sunday readings, she does read the versions from Mark chapter 13 and Luke 21, both also about the destruction of Jerusalem. One interpretive tradition is reflected in the Gospel reading for the first Sunday of Advent in year C. Here, the Church does something a little strange. She uses Luke's version of Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, about the destruction of Jerusalem, skips 5 verses through the transitional verses, and goes directly to Christ's primary teaching about his second coming. This represents an interpretive tradition that is most famously associated with St. Augustine. Augustine noticed that while these verses are about the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, as is Matthew 24 verses 29 through 31, they contain elements that apply in a secondary spiritual sense to all the comings of Christ in time. And that includes both Christ's first coming in his incarnation and his second coming, both subjects being the focus of Advent. But Augustine's interpretation also includes Christ's coming in the sacraments, like baptism and the Eucharist. All these meanings are captured by the Latin word for Advent, adventus, which means both to arrive and to come to. The theology of Christ's continual coming to his church throughout time is a foundational Catholic teaching. We can contemplate all these comings of Christ in light of these elements. We saw how the meaning of Christ coming on clouds, as found in Matthew and also here in Luke, applies to these different comings of Christ in our Coming on Clouds video. Once one understands the prophetic imagery in these verses, they can be applied to all the comings of Christ in a spiritual way. As we saw in our Gathering the Elect video, the four winds prophetic language refers primarily to the gathering of the remnant of the tribes of Israel from the Old Covenant into the New Covenant. And that was associated with the first generation of Christians from Pentecost up until and coincident with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and afterwards. So why would St. Augustine see this gathering element as pertaining to all the comings of Christ? Because it's similar to what Christ will do at his second coming, which will be to gloriously gather his elect to himself through the resurrection of the dead. Similarly, at Christ's first coming, there was a gathering of the shepherds and the magi to Christ in Bethlehem. Christ gathers his elect to himself through baptism. And those of us that are already part of the new covenant are gathered to Christ in the most radical and intimate way each time we receive the Eucharist. Once one understands the prophetic imagery in these verses, they can be applied to all the comings of Christ in a spiritual way. Two more interpretive traditions associated with Matthew 24 are found when the Church presents Mark's version in chapter 13 at the end of ordinary time in year B. The Church presents two distinct events, the destruction of Jerusalem and Christ's second coming, side by side, just as Jesus did in his discourse. One tradition has to do with what the Church calls types. Types are foundational to the way the Church has read the Bible for 2,000 years. It's a spiritual way to read the Bible, what the church refers to as the allegorical sense. We may not be familiar with the term types, but we may have heard that Moses prefigures Christ in the Bible, or that the parting of the Red Sea through Moses prefigures baptism, or that the flood of Noah also prefigures baptism. Those are examples of types. Types are people, places, or events that occurred in salvation history and prefigure what Christ fulfilled in the past and what he does in the present, especially in the sacraments, and what he will do in the future. Similarly, the flood of Noah and the destruction of the temple are types of the final judgment in Christ's second coming. There are similarities between these events, but fulfilled prophecies like Matthew 24 don't repeat themselves. In fact, types are often more different in their specifics than they are similar, and it's their differences which reveal the mysteries of our faith. From this perspective, even the destruction of the temple illuminates the mystery of baptism. We'll examine this idea of types in more detail and learn what these types can and can't tell us about the last days in a future video. But the most important interpretive tradition of the Church addresses why Jesus associated the event of the destruction of the temple with the separate event of his second coming. This is an important interpretive idea for understanding a Catholic view of the end times. It's summarized in the Catechism, paragraph 585. In quoting Matthew 24, the Church says, "On the threshold of his passion, Jesus announced the coming destruction of this splendid building, of which there would not remain one stone upon another. By doing so, he announced a sign of the last days, which were to begin with his own Passover." The Church teaches two important points here. First is that the last days, the end times, began with Christ's own Passover, his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension. We've been living in the last days, the final age of salvation, since the first century. The second coming of Christ is imminent, meaning it can occur at any moment. Second, the Church teaches that the destruction of the temple is a sign of the last days. Why was the destruction of the temple a sign of the last days? The answer lies in what the temple meant to the Jews throughout their history, in both their scriptures and their tradition. The Israelites regarded the temple as a miniature replica or microcosm of the earth and the cosmos. It was an architectural model specified by God. This idea is summarized in Psalm 78. He built his sanctuary, meaning his temple, like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. The temple had a multi-section layout. One section, the Holy of Holies, represented heaven, the dwelling place of God. There was a veil representing the cosmos with symbols of the stars and the constellations. And there were two sections which represented the land and the sea of the earth. Conversely, the cosmos itself is a macro temple of God. That idea is firmly established in the book of Genesis in the story of creation. And signs indicate larger events are set in motion. Jesus' cursing of a fig tree was a sign of the temple's upcoming desolation in 70 AD. So too the destruction of the temple, which was a replica or microcosm of the cosmos, was a sign of the upcoming destruction of the macro temple of the cosmos, the day heaven and earth will pass away. And just as Christ was put to death and was resurrected from the dead, so too the heavens and earth, the entire cosmos, will pass away and be gloriously resurrected into a new heavens and new earth at Christ's second coming. There's much more to the mystery of the temple. The theme of the temple is a golden thread that weaves together the scriptures, and it points us to the deepest mystery about the relationship between Christ and his church. We'll get to that mystery soon. In our next video, we'll take our final look at this section of Matthew and learn something that has only been recently discovered by 21st century scholarship. It's not exactly new. In fact, it's 2,000 years old. Matthew 24 was carefully constructed in a way that it could be memorized by ancient listeners. And when we see it, we'll hear what ancient listeners heard when they first heard Matthew 24. and it may change the way you hear the Bible. So click on the subscribe button so you won't miss it. And don't forget to share this video with your family and friends. God bless.